Alright, so in this lesson we're taking a look at the cycles of matter, and you completed a lab in class today that was dealing with the water cycle, and so let's take a little look at that lab. This is a picture of the lab, and basically what you did is you had this little blue tub that had water filled on the inside, so there was water on the inside. This was your source of light, which represented the sun. Your petri dish, which had ice in it, was going to be your area that was the coldest, or kind of representing the atmosphere. And down here was your clay, which represented the land. And so what you probably started to notice is that over time, on the edges of this, it became a little bit foggy. And it was foggy because of the fact that some of the water molecules were beginning to collect on the sides of it. And as you let this sit longer and longer and longer, you may have even noticed that on the underside of where this was, there was little water droplets that were beginning to develop. And if you would have let it sit even longer, eventually there would become so many of these that they would begin to fall down onto your land, and that would have represented the water cycle and given you a first-hand look as to how it works. And so we had our source of energy, we had our water, we had our atmosphere that was helping it cool, and we had our land. Now, some of yours might not have worked, or you might have ran out of time. And the reason for this is because of the fact that you might have put too much water on the inside. Remember, the water that you were choosing to use was cold water. And in order to get the water cycle moving, we have to get the water so it is warmed up. And the more water that you have, obviously the longer it's going to take to heat. So that means that this lamp was going to have to work extra long to be able to heat up the water on the inside. The less water you had, the quicker that it was going to heat up. And the second thing that might have been a change that we could have made in the lab is the fact that this bulb inside here was only a 60-watt bulb, which means that we could have used a stronger or a larger wattage of electricity for the bulb, so that way it could have heated up faster. So those are a couple of the changes that we could have made, but all in all, it did a pretty good job of letting you look at the lab and the water cycle. So let's talk a little bit about the water cycle. The water cycle, by definition, is basically the process by which water moves from the ground to the atmosphere back to the ground. And so it's a cycle. So imagine that you have a puddle. Okay, so this is your puddle. And that puddle is going to sit there for as long as it takes until the energy of the molecules in here transform from a liquid to a gas. In order to get that transformation to occur, we need some source of energy. And the energy is going to come in the form of heat. As long as the temperature is greater than 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, it is going to begin to get these molecules excited. Now, oftentimes when we're talking about a puddle after a rainstorm, the sun is going to shine down and it's going to generate energy in the particles, and the particles are going to become extremely excited. It works at the surface level, and what's going to happen is as they become more and more excited, what's going to happen is the fact that they are going to start to transform states. They're going to actually pop off at the surface level, and they're going to start to evaporate. and it's changing from a liquid to a gas. And we actually call the changing of a liquid to a gas water vapor. But that process of it moving from the liquid state and up into our atmosphere is known as evaporation. And so evaporation is basically the water changing from a liquid to a gas. Now, as it begins to rise up in our atmosphere, we have a couple of different layers. Okay, there is the layer that is the troposphere. There is a layer that is called the stratosphere. There is a layer that is called the mesosphere. And there is another layer that is called the thermosphere. And each one of these has a specific region, which we'll talk about coming up. But for the most part, what happens is the water rises up into the atmosphere part called the troposphere. And as it's going up, the temperature gets cooler and cooler and cooler. And what happens is that there are all kinds of different particles that are found up in our atmosphere. There are dust particles, there are pollutants. Our atmosphere is made up out of like 78% nitrogen. And so what happens is that these little water molecules begin to, switch the color for the blue, they begin to collect on these different particles. And as they begin to collect, there's more and more of them, which make a cloud. And once that cloud gets so heavy with these different water particles, they begin to fall back down. And that process is known as precipitation. And that happens in the form of rain, sleet, snow, and hail. So, we have to give a definition for evaporation. And this process is known as the water cycle. It's basically the water getting heated up, changing from a liquid to a gas, which we know as water vapor. It rises, it cools, it collects onto some type of particle, and it falls back down to the ground in the form of precipitation. But our definition of evaporation is basically the process by which molecules of liquid water absorb energy and change to a gas. And you were able to see that in the lab. Basically, the water back on this slide, where you had the water that was beginning to get heated up and it was transforming and collecting on the sides as it was going from a liquid to a gas. And that process was known as evaporation. Condensation was the process by which a gas changes to a liquid. So what happens is that originally it got heated up, and as it began to cool down, it went from a gas into a liquid, and that process is known as condensation. And the final one is precipitation, which is rain, sleet, snow, hail, freezing, rain. Any of those are examples of precipitation. And it's basically the liquid that falls back to Earth. Surface. And that's what we saw. This was evaporation. This part was the condensation. And the condensation turned to precipitation. And that's the water cycle. And that's one of the cycles of matter. Now, there are two other types of cycles of matter that we're going to talk briefly about. basically, the first one is known as the oxygen cycle. And the oxygen cycle, which is also known as the carbon cycle, is the idea that you have carbon and oxygen circulating. So we could take, for example, a fire. Maybe there is a fire that occurs in a field, or maybe a forest is on fire. So this is the fire that is going on. And what happens is that when that process works, it is going to release carbon into our atmosphere. Or you could have a person. Now obviously this doesn't happen as much as with fires, but we breathe out CO2, which is carbon dioxide. And so just like the other one, that is going to be released into the atmosphere. It could be other types of carbon that are released as well from factories or other human types of organisms that release carbon. And so you basically have carbon being released into the atmosphere. And what happens is that as you have plants, and trees obviously are part of the plant family, but what they do is they actually take in that carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And as they do that, they actually are able to release off oxygen. And that oxygen is what we are able to breathe in. And so you end up with the cycle of basically humans releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and some of the organisms that are able to photosynthesize, in fact all the organisms that are able to photosynthesize, are able to take in that carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And so this one is really it's a brief look at the oxygen-carbon cycle. The reason why the term carbon and oxygen are grouped together is because of the fact that it's always carbon is being released, oxygen is being given off. And so this whole process is known as either the carbon cycle or the oxygen cycle. The other type of cycle that we could talk about and the book describes is called the nitrogen cycle. And this one is basically the idea where you have nitrogen being released. And so if we take, for example, nitrogen that might be released from, let's say, a decomposed animal. So imagine that this is some type of animal, like maybe a deer. It's time for a Banish drawing, as we'd say in class. Give it some horns and a tail, and we'll label it. But what happens is that as this organism gets decomposed with the bacteria, and it's basically going to release nitrogen into the ground. And as it releases that into the ground, it is going to help the grass grow. And as the grass begins to grow, it's going to be then consumed by organisms. So our primary consumers are going to eat the grass. So primary consumers eat plants, and grass obviously is a part of it. And as they eat that, they are going to take in the nitrogen, and what's going to happen then is obviously they will eventually die, and as they begin to die, they will again decompose. And so we start to see this nitrogen moving in a type of cycle. Now I know that the nitrogen and the carbon and the oxygen cycle is a little bit more complex. We're going to spend some time before we would take a quiz, talking a little bit more and giving some examples of that and trying to understand it. I don't need you to understand it real far in depth. I really want you to understand that matter, by definition, which is anything that has mass and takes up space, is going to move from one place to another, or one state to another. And so the water cycle is the big one that I want you to take away. We're going to spend some time talking about the nitrogen and carbon cycle and give you a better understanding of that. But for now, what I'd like you to do is to fill out the summary. I'd like you to be honest about the things that you need to more clarification about. But also, it's important to make sure that you're spending time and using a complete sentence for each one of the questions, because I read these and it's helpful for me to understand what I need to go over a little bit more heavily in our next class together. That's it for now. See ya.